Hi, welcome to Perspectives, a podcast that we do here at Orchard Hill to try to speak to current issues. We took a pause for the last several months after several years of releasing Perspectives, or before that, an Ask a Pastor podcast on a weekly basis, where we would try to bring about topics that are on people's minds, are current, and not really necessarily have a Bible study on it, but speak about the perspective, sometimes in the gray areas where the Bible doesn't speak. Sometimes the Bible speaks to it directly, but it needs some more fleshing out. And so that is what we're doing. And our plan moving forward now is to release one a month. We believe that maybe by making it a little longer, a little more detailed, we'll be able to address some of the current issues. And so today I'm joined by James and Jenna, two of our student ministry FIND team. James has been a part of Orchard Hill for a little over a year as he moved and has taken the lead for our student ministries. Jenna has been here for 14 years.
That's next
longevity
week.
In terms of next week. And I knew that because I just actually wrote you a note, which you probably haven't gotten yet.
I read it, thank you.
Did you? All right, saying thank you for 14 years. That's how I knew it was 14 years. And so it's great just to have you both here. And today we're going to talk about abortion. And so I thought having two of our student ministry leaders here to talk about that with me would be helpful, because abortion is certainly a long-standing issue, but it's almost like it's being rediscovered right now by students who, for many students, this has been a settled issue for most of their lives, and all of a sudden they're experiencing this for the first time. For people who are my age, I also grew up with it being generally settled, but it was still an issue of debate when I was younger. And I think it has almost ceased to be an issue of debate until this last summer, when obviously the Dobbs decision came down and it changed everything. And I was looking for some stats on this just because I like to understand perspective. Since Roe versus Wade in 1973, there have been over 63 million abortions. There were some years where there were over 1 million. The number has dropped each year. But if you think about that, that's 63 million people whose lives have not happened. And I realize when we frame this issue that some people will say, well, this is an easy issue. We frame the issue as it's life, it's not life, it's right, it's wrong, it's murder, it's that simple. And then other people say this is really a woman's right issue. This is a sovereignty of the body. This is really about equal opportunity for women. And so what I'd like to do is just start with the framing of the issue question and just say, how do you understand and think people come at it from such different vantage points? Because obviously if you grant the narrative that it is an issue of right and wrong, life and death, few people on the other side would say, oh my goodness, yes, go ahead and kill. And similarly, if you frame the issue as this is sovereignty of a woman's body's choice, few people would say, oh, I want to tell women what they should do with their bodies.
Not about few people would say that.
Well,
less.
Yeah.
Less people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's not this impulse to say, I want to be telling other people what they can or can't do with their bodies, unless you think there's some other moral imperative engaged in it. So, for example, I would not be inclined to, like drugs are an issue. I don't have a big desire to tell people what they should or shouldn't do with drugs, other than when it impacts other people. And that's what I'm saying. There's an impulse for most people to say, you do whatever you want to do with you as long as it doesn't impact anybody else. So how do you guys understand just the framing of the issue and why that matters in this?
No, go for it.
No, I mean, I do think that I think there's two sides of it, right? There is, if you do put it on just a life and death issue, there are going to be very few that disagree with that. Although it's interesting, as I've kind of engaged with this over the summer on, yes, I'm on TikTok and Instagram, social media. there is some of that shift of people just saying it is black and white. And, I saw videos, and I guess, granted it's sensationalized, but I think, seeing videos of protesters saying, I support killing babies. And I thought that was really interesting because it's like, I think it's just a little bit of a shift into that, a little bit more of territory where we haven't been before. So I don't know. I'm still trying to wrap my brain around the complexity of this issue. And again, I lived in a time where it was more or less sealed. And so the fact that it's kind of, we are where we're at, it's a lot to process, and it's a lot to try to make heads or tails out of the layers. Because I don't think it's there are, on a surface level and a biblical level, I think it's pretty cut and dry, but there are multiple layers.
Okay, so how is it cut and dry? Just let's hear your thoughts
Sure,
on
sure.
What's cut and dry.
So I read in Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a great example because God is speaking to the prophet Jeremiah, and in the beginning, chapter 1, he says, "Before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you." And so to me, it creates this pretty black and white, cut and dry of life begins at the moment of conception. Would even make the argument it begins even before that, as God is all-knowing and the author of all things. Like in Jeremiah, he makes the case of, even before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you. And so I think, for me, in reading that, I come out of that thinking that, or believing that life begins before conception.
Okay.
And I think that's where people see it differently.
Sure.
Because most of the people that I know that are for at least making it legal, even if they wouldn't necessarily choose it for themselves, they don't see somebody's personhood, their soul, their being existing before they're born. And so to them, to at least people I've talked to, it's not I'm committing murder. There's a biological thing that's happening, and it's a different perspective of when life begins. And so then if you say, well that, whatever words you want to use in there, some people, fetus, whatever. If that's not really a person, then removing it from a person's body it's like removing any, you have a cyst that needs excised. You have, it's a medical procedure. It's not.
So what
I think
would you say to a student who comes to you and says, "This is my understanding, and I am pregnant, and so I'm seeing it that way, but I want to make sure that I'm biblically not wrong." What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who has been pregnant, like there's no doubt in my mind that they were people inside of my body. Like they are a whole person. God made them on purpose. Their life began before they could live outside of me. Like that's a whole person. And I think the difficult the part of that conversation comes whenever you start talking about the nuance of, okay, now what does this mean for you? Because biblically it's pretty clear that is a child that God has created. That's a whole person. God has a purpose for their life. There's a plan for them. And abortion is that's their life you're taking away. But whenever it just becomes that, and we don't start to have the conversation with those mothers, with the other family that's involved about, okay, what does this look like for you? This is really hard. Acknowledging how difficult of a choice that is. Like when you start to skip past the gray area and just be like, no, like that, there's a right and wrong, deal with it. I think that's whenever people miss seeing the heart of Jesus and how we treat them.
Yeah, there's certainly in conversation a difference between I believe something and I have compassion for where you are.
Yeah.
What I think makes this issue challenging is there are some issues where you may say, oh, I have a belief and you have a belief, but here there is life that is the outcome of a choice at that point. That even for me, I would say, even if somebody were to say, well, I don't believe it's a life, well, it certainly is a life that is coming. And if you don't do anything, it will be. And so there is at least that. And I know in my own journey on this, certainly there were some biblical arguments, but I wasn't really swayed by biblical authority when I was necessarily a teenager, and at least right away. And a couple of the key moments, I remember as a kid, and this is pre-internet, that's how old I am, but I remember going to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and they used to have a display at where they had fetuses that had been not aborted but lost, miscarried, and they had them at all the different weeks all the way along. They had one for every week. And I remember walking down that display and seeing the body form at such an early age and thinking, how can you do this? And especially when you get to late term abortions where it really becomes obvious. And so one of the interesting things in the current debate is, and I think, James, you alluded to this, is now people have seen the pressing of the logic toward the issue of, well, if you would abort late in pregnancy, why not after birth? And so some people have started to say, yeah, I'm not going to stand against that wherever it is. Now, people have talked about fetal viability and some of those things, and certainly there's something, but even as a society, we know intuitively that it is a life, because in the same hospital that will abort sometimes late term, they'll fight just down the hall to save the life of the child. And will even criminalize if you get into an altercation with a woman who loses a baby, and all of a sudden it's a double homicide, or it's a and so we know intuitively if somebody wants that to be a life, it's a life. And then certainly in my own journey as well, and I've shared this publicly, but just having been adopted myself, and the journey of the conversation where when I finally had a conversation with my birth mom, and she said the words to me, if abortion had been legal when you were born, I was born just a little before Roe versus Wade, she said I would have had you aborted. And for me, that was one of those moments where, okay, my life may not have been this great contribution to society, but it at least mattered to my wife, to my boys, to a few other folks. And you take away 63 million of those people from our society, and there's a huge societal loss. There's a huge, just to say we're just erasing these because we don't want to deal with a pregnancy, that for me was part of my journey. Now, one of the things that people will say is, okay, that's nice, you have that view. So you say then that girls who are raped, victims of incest, should have to carry a baby to term. So how would you deal with that situation, and how do you deal with that as a bigger question and construct?
Because it's real. It's not. That's not a hypothetical.
No, that isn't.
This only affects a few people.
Well, statistically, it only affects less than 1% of the abortions. But yes.
How many people is that?
It's a lot. It's 20,000. It's 60,000 a year is what it would be.
They're reported.
Yeah.
There's.
Right.
I have worked with.
Actually, it would be 6,000 a year. 600. The stats are.
You notice how I just agreed because I gave up on doing the mental math on
629,000 abortions according to some, so 800,000. So 1% would be 6 to 8,000 a year.
And those are cases attributed directly to rape and incest.
Correct. It's under 1% is what the reported numbers tend to be. If I have that wrong, you can send an email to james@orchardhillchurch.com. That's not actually his email, so
send it there.
So it's all good. But somewhere in that number.
Yeah.
And again, to your point, I'm not trying to diminish the issue by saying that. I'm just saying what the argument often, and this is true in most arguments, is people will take the extreme case and say, because you believe this, you must believe this, and if you believe this, I can't even listen to you on the rest of the argument.
And
now, to be fair,
so polarized.
that's right. To be fair, for those people, that is a very real case. Yeah. So how do you guys deal with that? How would you deal with that personally, advising students, each of those things?
I have walked through post-rape counseling with more girls than I can name. And it's so hard because, I mean, you were talking about how, you know, it almost seems like a person's not a person until someone wants them. You know, and it's like, okay, well, is her body not her own if somebody else wants it? You know, like there's so many layers to it. And being raped is traumatic enough to destroy a person's life under the right circumstances if they don't have support, if they don't have a place where they can go to feel seen and heard and known and cared for, if they don't have a community around them, if they don't have people that believe them. Just rape is enough to ruin a person's life and set them on a bad trajectory for a whole lot of things. But if you take that and then you build in a whole extra person that they weren't planning on, that they didn't, they're oftentimes not in a position to be able to care for well, to give the kind of life that they would want to give their child, whatever. Like, but I mean, you talk to those girls, and I think it's just so hard. Is that child still a person? Absolutely yes. Would I encourage her and provide as many resources as I could to make sure that that child was able to have the kind of life that a person deserves to have? Yes. But I think that if we say, oh, well, it's just, you know, I'm not saying you saying this, I'm saying there are folks who would be like, well, because it's less than 1%, like, that's not even the issue. And it's like, okay, but they're whole people, and there needs to be support systems for them. There needs to be people who believe them. There needs to be, hospital systems that are set up to be able to process the date rape kits in timely manner so that the men that have raped them can be actually prosecuted. There needs to be a system that believes women when they say, this is what's happened to me. And because I was listening to a lot of people's stories this week in preparation for this conversation. And the one conversation that I heard was this girl, and she was like, as soon as I got pregnant, nobody cared that I got raped. You want to talk about a person not feeling like a person?
Yeah.
You know, I think that it's just, there's so much more that needs to happen to come around somebody in that situation legally, ethically, you know, like medically supporting, community resources coming around that, counseling. Like there's so many things that they need that most women don't have access to who are in that situation. I think what people think of is like, oh, this like rich white girl that has everything and parents can just take care of it. Like they think like, oh, we'll just have the baby and it's easy. And if you don't want to care for the child, just give it to somebody. There's just this not what most people are dealing with in those situations. And so it's hard.
I think you're right that there's a sense in which the more privilege you come from, the easier it is to deal with the situation.
Which it is.
Easy is not the right word, obviously. They're
There's
less
less barriers.
complex. However, there is still in our nation an extensive waiting list for people who are wanting to take newborns. And so there are wonderful homes available for somebody who wants to place a newborn. Where we fall down as a country substantially is kids with age. There are so many kids who are of age that nobody wants to take in, that they're left in the system. Newborns are still highly sought.
Yeah.
And so
Healthy
somebody,
newborns.
Healthy newborns, that's right.
Healthy white newborns.
No, that's not necessarily true. I'd love to see your stats on that.
Okay.
I mean, do you have them offhand?
I don't think.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm just saying that there's a narrative there.
Yeah.
That is that, but I don't know that that's true.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to be proved wrong on it, but my pushback would be I don't think that that's true at this point. Because one of the, and now we're going to go down a whole other trail,
Let's go. Let's
but,
go. I packed my backpack.
Well, it's an interesting. So one of the narratives of this whole thing is that this is worse for people of color, and that's an interesting issue. But I've heard it said that the number one killer of black people is Planned Parenthood, and I can't verify those stats, but we need to be aware that, okay, yes, there are some race issues that are tied to this, but I think there's a lot more tied to poverty and wealth than race. I think poverty for white people who are poor, people who are of any ethnic descent, is a much more complicating issue than race per se. Now, are there some potential race issues? Yeah, but it's definitely more of an economic challenge than it is purely a race challenge. Now, again, it doesn't mean that there isn't some complicity there, but I would say one of the real challenges in this issue is to detangle narrative that are easy, quick answers.
Yeah.
And let's blame white privilege or something like that for this, to the whole other issue. And I'll just speak to my situation. What I've pieced together of it, single woman, 21 years old, pregnant from a guy who wasn't her boyfriend, out kind of having fun for a few days, and then says, oops. Came from some resource, not a lot, enough that she could change schools, because in the era there it was, I need to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
But it was, I can't raise this child. I don't have the money, the resource, potential to do this, and so I'm going to put this kid in the system. And so that does happen for white people, black people,
Yeah.
across the board. So
You use the word detangle, and I think that's a really accurate and good picture in coming alongside of students, especially students who are walking through this issue, because I feel like it's in the moment, as you outlined, in an instance of sexual assault or abuse. I think that it's really easy to kind of, at least for me, to go to here's a black and white answer. The Bible speaks against abortion, it's wrong. And, in that, there's, like you said, Jenna, there's so many layers to that. And so I think for me, just hitting a pause point and saying, all right, I think there's a lot of, you need to acknowledge the emotional and the physical damage that's been done here, and almost like come alongside of the person at that level before you ever even engage in the issue at hand. So yeah, it entangled. I think you just almost untangling that is. I think that's a really it's a good word picture for the situation, because it isn't. It's usually not very cut and dry and black and white. In those instances of where you're working with students alongside of this. So at least that's been my experience.
yeah, what's important, I think, is that if you're ever in a situation to walk with somebody who's having to make that choice, is that you take the time to hear their story,
Right.
and to walk with them where they are, not simply to say, here's my answer. The flip side is when we, I mean the church, Christians in general, when we try to start with the story generally rather than the truth, sometimes it can come across as if there isn't a standard or an ideal. And I do think that that's important, because I think, especially now, there is a generation that's coming along that will say, well, is this really biblical? Do I need to hold to one view over the other? I think, I've heard this Christian, that Christian say that they believe that this is okay. And so there's a both and to this,
Sure.
in terms of being able to
Sure.
say, I want to walk with people, and I want to also be able to say, I do think that there's a biblical norm, and that adding that layer even to a painful situation first might actually increase the trauma, not decrease it for a young woman who goes through it. To say, it's a horrific thing to go through any kind of an assault and abuse, but to say, but then I did give life and give somebody an opportunity to live a life from that, potentially could actually reduce the trauma, because again, statistically, one of the things you hear is that there's a lot of regret trauma on the backside of abortion, which is, again, not always reported because it doesn't fit the cultural narrative that this is just a choice. But there's certainly a lot of women who have walked through the reality of, I made an easy choice for me, and now I've regretted that for years in some cases.
Yeah, you can't wait till it's not a detangleable situation. You can't wait till you have everything figured out and settled and then come with truth. It's such a complicated situation. You can't let's figure this all out first, because that's not going to happen.
I do think that there, and maybe I need to back up a little bit in what I was saying. I mean, I do think that there, to your point, Kurt, it is communicating the biblical standard, and a student saying like, hey, this is the situation. Saying, well, here's what I believe. Here's what I believe the Bible to be true, and communicate. But saying, I'm here to walk with you through this situation. And so I do think that puts forth a biblical standard. It puts forth, here's what God's word says on that. But my posture as an individual is to say, you know what, I'm here to walk alongside of you through this decision, through this journey that you're in right now. And so I think, for me, it is a little bit of both and there.
Well, and what's challenging, I think, too, is so as a person of faith, I have convictions about all kinds of things that a non-believing person may not have convictions about. And there are a whole host of them that I'm okay saying, you don't need to believe what I believe. I believe this, and I'm going to practice this, you practice that. But then there are some things that have a higher calling, and in terms of they should have some universal application. Certainly an issue of life, I think, treating people with dignity and respect across the board. Some of those issues aren't just like for example, I could say, well, I believe the 10 Commandments restrict me from using the Lord's name in vain. Okay, well, when I go out with a couple guys who aren't believers and they use the Lord's name in vain, I don't feel the need to sit there and say, stop it. And you're using the Lord's name in vain, and that's offensive to God. Now, do I believe that? Absolutely. Sure. But I don't need to bring that into every occasion in which I live and move. But there are some issues that are different in terms of the pushback that we should give. So one of the challenges, and I think this is true for students, it's true for adults, young adults especially, that I think happens is, okay, even if I believe this, if I believe that abortion is not right before God, not the best public choice, not the best vision for the future of our nation, whatever way you want to put it, I feel like I'm ostracized in current culture if I take that position. I'm made to be an oppressor. I'm on the wrong side of history. I'm part of the patriarchy, the group that hates women, the group that on and on and on, because that's the way it's being positioned right now in culture. So how do you help a student? How do you help a young adult? How do you yourselves navigate that piece of the dialogue in order to help somebody say, okay, I don't want to be part of that, all the characterizations, but yet I still have an underlying belief that says maybe that's right. How do you help somebody navigate that?
Well, I feel like my knee-jerk reaction is to say, again, yes, abortion is the issue, but you have to pull back from that a layer, because I think the root of the issue is you're dealing with two philosophies, two different worldviews, and that's going to then, from that, is going to affect your view on abortion, is going to affect your view on a whole number of issues. So to me, I think, when a student's coming with this concern, it's like, all right, yes, we need to deal with this, but we have to pull back, because the issue here is, you're trying to have a worldview conversation with somebody who perhaps subscribes to, maybe a humanistic worldview, whereas we subscribe to a biblical worldview. And so I think if you just kind of run from issue to issue and you're it's a little bit like running from fire to fire versus pulling back and saying, all right, we need to understand differing worldviews and why, like that's the root of, I don't know if I'm making sense, but I think that tends to be more of the root.
Sense, we're in trouble because I'm following.
You know what I'm saying? I think that's like it's almost pulling back from the issue at hand, and not to deflect, but really to get to the root of it and say, all right, let's understand worldview here. Let's understand why these conclusions are being drawn.
Because I think that pressure to conform, like there's two sides, pick one. One is right, one is wrong. Where you're going to be, I mean, that comes from your, 15-second TikTok sound bites and it's like, that is not the place to have deep conversations. That is not the place to have meaningful conversations. And I think one way that we can start to combat it is to create spaces like this podcast to have conversations, have deeper conversations, have nuanced conversations. And I think part of it starts with having those conversations with people that believe differently than you. Mm-hmm. And seeing each other as human, understanding, like listening to understand, not to reply, and starting a place where, even if it's just you inviting people over for dinner and it's not this, grand, I'm starting a nonprofit that's going to eradicate 15-second sound bites of, that's, I don't think that's a dream we're going to realize anytime soon. Mm-hmm. But I think the cultural polarization, it's not helping anybody, and sitting here talking about how much I hate the cultural polarization is not going to stop it. Mm-hmm. But what is within my power to change me as an individual is to start having these conversations, to start listening, to start creating a place, even just within my own life, that's safe to process, and listening.
So one of the things that's interesting to me, being the age I am, so I grew up late 70s, 80s, it was my childhood. This issue was one that was truly debated.
Yeah.
And it was seen as, you can be on a different side of this and we just disagree. What's interesting now that the issues come roaring back, it is, you're a pariah if you're pro-life, because you are patriarchal, hateful. Even President Biden's speech the other night, where he kind of did the whole, if you're a MAGA American, you're somebody who is a threat to democracy. You are everything that's wrong with our world, basically. And without trying to get into all of that, the reason though that ties in here is it's the same positioning, and what happens is now it's a virtue signaling thing where I go on TikTok, I go on Instagram, and I say, here's where I am on this, and I don't want to be part of that. Now, obviously, there's people who are part of that also who would throw the despair.
Goes both ways.
Absolutely, there is that, and obviously you're exactly right. We're not going to eradicate that other than trying to have a conversation, but it's in that culture that we live and move now where even exploring and saying, is this a possible way to view things? I saw a video by Bill Maher the other day, and I don't watch everything Bill Maher does, and he's somewhat crass at times, so I'm not recommending him. Again, send emails to James at Orchard Hill Church, but
James is going to turn off his email
notifications. Right. Well,
it's not my email.
It's not his email.
They can
so
send
that's
why all they want.
That's why I gave him the wrong email. What I found interesting and about this, and I'm going to mention this, it'll be out there before you guys all see this, but he was talking about transgenderism and homosexuality and some of those things. Now, he's a gay man who is left on all of his politics, and he was talking about transgenderism, and his point was basically to say, when we start experimenting on children and we're in a new era, I have to be able to at least ask the question, is this wise? And he said, you can't simply say because I'm a minority or I'm in a marginalized unit that you can't even ask the question. Mic drop, leave me alone. And I thought he was exactly right on that issue, because that's exactly where we've gotten to. If I can identify as being one of these oppressed minorities, then you can't even question what's going on. And he was saying, if we're going to start doing surgery on kids, we should at least be able to ask the question, is this wise as a society? And again, from where he sits, it's probably easier to ask because he's not in the group that's considered patriarchy,
Sure.
Everything else. But again, that is part of the cultural challenge to this issue at this exact moment is if I'm a 17-year-old, if I'm a 27-year-old kind of coming of age in this, I'm saying so many people in the culture will tell me that if I hold this view, that I am an oppressor.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be an oppressor. I don't want to be any part of that. Therefore, I'm either going to be silent on this or I'm going to not hold the view.
It's fascinating to me how you have to be this extreme or that extreme, and there's just not room in the middle. I had a student text me about a month ago, and she said, "Do you hate gay people?" That was the opening text. And I was like, "No, do you?" She was like, "Well, no." And I was like, "Why did you ask that question?" And then we started to have a conversation about some things that she's been thinking about, and it's like, okay, why? I hate that, because I believe that life, begins at conception. I get lumped into this group of people who send death threats to abortion providers. That's not who I am. That's not how I live my life. And yet, because we agree on this one thing, I'm with them. I'm like, I don't want to be with them. I don't want to be on their team. They're mean. They're scary. I don't want to be on their team. How is there not allowed in so many ways and in so many viewpoints to be, these many different places in the middle? Why do I have to agree with everything someone says because I agree with them on one thing? That's dumb.
And I think as we're talking, I'm thinking back to, is almost the conversation I think needs to be had at some point or some level of, when Jesus says, if they hated me in the same way they'll hate you, for standing on biblical teaching. And so I do think that that can be a little bit of a cop-out for, well, we don't even need to talk about this because we're going to be hated on based on what we, based because we believe the Bible. But I think there also is a little bit of wisdom in saying, I don't know that we're ever going to see total reconciliation on this issue because, it's more or less kind of promised in Scripture. Jesus communicated that truth to us that, listen, this is going to polarize people. It's either going to turn people on, it's going to turn people off, and when you follow me, that's going to come with persecution.
And I think the frustrating thing for me is when people stop there, and they're like, "Well, you hate me," and I'm like, "No, I am not. It's not. I don't want to be lumped."
Right,
like the
you were
people,
saying.
the group of folks who send death threats to abortion providers. Let's use them as my example. So many people are like, "Oh, well, they hate what I'm doing." And I'm like, "Yeah, because you're threatening to kill people. That's not good." How can, I think the question for me around this that is core is, how can the church show up and love so well that folks can say, "Okay, I get that we disagree on some pretty cool, important things, but I cannot argue the fact that you are loving well." I think so many people stop at being angry, and anger doesn't solve anything. Typing stuff in Facebook comments doesn't solve anything. Never in the history of the internet has somebody's life been complete. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's one. But I'm pretty sure that like Facebook comment arguing isn't going to change the world,
Well,
but loving people might.
It's the same virtue. It's the self-righteous virtue signaling. Even if I'm typing that for people to go, oh, I like that. I like what you are saying. I'm with you, because it's like tribalism again. But you're right. Real change comes with real love and demonstrated love. And so certainly the church's best position forward isn't just to holler truth, but it's to demonstrate love while speaking truth. And those two things together become more compelling.
And not just, I think we can't stop at, well, I'll love you if you agree with me.
Sure.
I'll take care of you if you do X, Y, and Z that I think you should do. But love people where they're at, and love people in ways that make like actual change in the system. You know, like advocate for a better foster care system so that when a woman's in trouble, she doesn't say the foster care system is scarier than having an abortion, so I'm going to pick an abortion because I know what's going to happen to my kid if they go in there. Like, advocate for change for there. Like, actually support legislation that is going to make it terrible for someone if they rape someone.
Well,
you know, like
the issue is,
do a Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world.
The church wants to be pro-life and thriving life at every turn.
Yeah.
One of the legitimate criticisms of people who are pro-life, I think, is the idea of you only care about life in the womb, not the quality of life once a child is born. And there is a challenge to that. I don't know that that's always a fair criticism.
Any generalization isn't going to
Well, just because, again, I think you could say the church, again, you talk about the church universal, does provide some great foster care options. Does it address all of it? Of course not.
No.
So could we do more? Of course.
And are there people who call themselves Christians that aren't actually living out Jesus? And they're like, oh, well, I'm a Christian, so I'm going to live this way. And you're like, I mean...
Right. But, I mean, the church historically has actually been on the forefront of a lot of social causes that have mattered and have brought societal change. And so we do want to celebrate and point to those, even, you know, certainly if you looked at hospitals, and so many of the hospitals were formed by Christians, Catholics, who said, you know what, this is something we can do to care for our society and our culture. So many adoption agencies have been that, foster placement agencies have been faith-based. So there is a sense in which the church has done that. Maybe an individual response is to say, what have I done? How can I participate in just one agency? I don't have to solve the whole problem, but can I contribute to one agency that's making a difference, one life that's making a difference? And if the millions of Christians who lived today said, I'm going to be pro-life, not just in my position, but in reality, in some tangible way, that is a helpful step forward.
And even if someone doesn't necessarily have financial resources to contribute, there's so many ways that you can, you know, like gather resources and support, you know, a mom that needs help getting stuff ready for a baby. You can mentor girls who are at risk of this sort of thing. You can, I mean, there's so many things you can do even if you don't have financial resources. Because I think what happens with some people, like, oh, well, I can't fix the big problem. I can't donate $1 million to this charity. So what's the point of even doing anything? You know, but I think it's those little moments of true living out the life that Jesus has called us to, living out the love that he had for people, showing it in tangible ways. Like, that snowballs, and the kingdom of God is going to change the world. And it is the...
Well, Jesus' statement, it's like a mustard seed, or it's like yeast. It means that it starts almost imperceptibly, invisibly. So it is the little choices that millions of people make that influence the culture more than here's the one legislation. And I think what American Christians are seeing right now is, for years it was, let's see Roe versus Wade overturned. And now it's overturned. And oh my goodness, now the real issue begins, because now it's state to state. It's life to life. It isn't just as simple as, oh, that was overturned. now this issue is done, do a victory lap. It's now it actually requires more because there's a nuance that's much more pervasive than it was when it was just focused on that one big issue. So, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, to speak to the small steps really do have big impact. My mom was adopted. She was, but she was sponsored. It started with a sponsorship of an American family because she's Korean, and just a simple. And it wasn't a large donation every month, but it was a small donation every month, and that ended up leading to an adoption, and then lent itself to her being led to the Lord, and just so it really set the trajectory, which then in turn, I mean, just has the ripple effect of establishing, that heritage, and just in my life, and then in my daughter's, and so like I do think, to speak to your point, and I've seen it firsthand. I think people can downplay, well, my effort isn't enough, or my effort is too small to really make an impact, and I mean, it's not. I know that we're like on staff and at a church and we're supposed to say that, but it really, like, the proof is in the pudding. It does, those small steps can just be life altering and just have huge impact for generations to come. So,
good. Any other things you want to say that you haven't had a chance to say about abortion that haven't been said, haven't been addressed?
I don't think politics is going to solve everything. And I think that the more we focus on people, I think that's the way that you can make a huge difference.
Okay.
I think we've said what needs to be said in this setting. I know it's so hard because this conversation it's so multifaceted. There's so many ripples to it, and I think people are still trying to wrap their brains and their minds around, okay, how do we respond? Because it seemed like that shift came out of nowhere, this last summer. And so I know for me, I'm still trying to make heads or tails about, what impact is this going to have, on long term?
Yeah, no, it's, I would say that the belief that a life is a gift from God to be celebrated as a culture is still an important starting point. So many times we go to the extreme situations or the arguments and start doing the let's argue, but the position that life is a gift from God and that more human life leads to more human flourishing is actually, Christians are on the right side of that in this. And that is a beautiful thing to celebrate. I mean, when you think about 63 million lives that didn't happen in our country, think about how many artists, scientists, school teachers, fire people, how many different just lives have been, and then by extension, how many children didn't have. I mean, that to me is one of the ways to think about it. And even when we think about the issue in terms of race, if there are more abortions that take place in minority communities, again, think about the flourishing that could have happened with more lives, like how many people could have come that could have, again, rewritten some of our nation's dialogue on race, even potentially. And I realize, again, that saying that there will be those who say, but that's not the way the system's set up, the system. But again, lives do lead to more opportunity, more people. And as a nation, it's even interesting. I think I saw somewhere that a few years ago, for the first time, our birth rate dropped below 2. And historically, any 2 people per family, whatever the deal is, historically, no nation has thrived with a birth rate that's less than a replacement, at least, of their own population. And certainly there's arguments there around immigration, things like that can all be made part of that. But historically, once a nation tips below that and stays below that.
I think statistically it's impossible too, isn't
Right.
it? To ever.
Well, that's where
To
immigration
recover,
comes in.
right.
So
Sure.
part of the argument for looser immigration would be we actually need the human resource to come into our country to continue to thrive, which is actually true because we're a negative birth rate. Now, I wouldn't say that one has to be exclusive of the other. Again, that's a whole nother argument, but that is part of...
That'll be on your next podcast. We'll put
yeah.
that in the queue.
That's right. Well, it is an interesting discussion
Sure.
because just economically,
Right.
if a nation doesn't have an increasing number of people, at some point, the economics of a nation start to turn downward, and that's why nations don't thrive once they have a negative birth rate, at least for long. And certainly, like Japan has been able to do that for a season here, but long term, that's not probably sustainable because, again, any nation in history that has a negative birth rate sooner or later has an economic downturn and ceases to thrive and all of that. So anyway, that's a whole nother discussion. It wasn't my main thought as much as
Tune in next month.
life leads to human flourishing. More life leads to a nation flourishing, and that is part of the Christian mandate, is to say, how do we help our world flourish? And just life itself helps that, and that is a good part of the argument as well, not just it's morally wrong, but it actually leads to better life for all people who are part of the nation currently. So thank you for taking a few minutes to be part of this. If you have questions that you'd like to see addressed, feel free to email James at email info@orchardhillchurch.com, and that is an actual email. And if you do have comments, if you think we were wrong on something, do feel free to email info@orchardhillchurch.com, and we'd be happy to address that even in coming episodes. We can look backward and say, here's what somebody said we had wrong, and we'd be happy to address that. We don't proclaim to have every answer, every nuance right. What we're willing to do is to discuss a difficult topic and what it means to be a Christian and deal with difficult cultural issues. And that's really our heart for this podcast, is to say we do have some different perspectives, sometimes even as Christians, on difficult issues. And so we aren't a monolithic group of people who all think exactly the same. And so being able to discuss and think about these issues, the church should be a place, church podcast should be a place where we can talk about hard issues and not necessarily agree with each person completely, but be able to say, but we go to the same source, and here's how we've come to see this issue. So thanks, have a great day.